In 1945, the men came home with duffel bags and tired eyes and not much else. They came back from the Pacific, from Europe, from mess halls in the Philippines and foxholes in France, where they had eaten whatever the army put in front of them and been grateful for it. And when they walked through the front door, something was already on the stove. It was always already on the stove. Because the women hadn't stopped cooking during the war, they had cooked through rationing, through meat shortages, through butter stamps and sugar books, and weeks when the grocery store shelves looked half empty. They had learned things in those years. Real things, the kind you learn when you have no margin for error and a family standing at the table waiting. They knew how to make something from almost nothing. They knew how to feed 5 people on what a restaurant today would throw in the trash. For about 10 years after the war ended, those kitchens kept running. The meals kept coming, and then, very deliberately, someone decided that was embarrassing. Someone decided these women needed to be modern. They needed convenience. They needed to stop doing what they were doing. These are the meals that got erased. 25 of them. And not one of them deserved to disappear. Number 25, creamed chipped beef on toast. The soldiers called it SOS. That stood for things we won't repeat here, but the meaning was clear. They had eaten it so many mornings in the mess hall that it had become a joke. What they didn't say, what none of them said when they got home, was that they kind of missed it. Dried beef, shaved paper thin, warmed in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then poured over 2 slices of toast. A jar of dried, chipped beef cost 19 cents in 1947. The whole dish came together in 8 minutes. In factory towns across Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, men who had spent 3 years eating this in army canteens came home and found their wives already making the civilian version because thrifty women had been stretching salt-cured beef over toast for decades before the military discovered it. By 1953, it was fading. By 1960, it was gone from most tables. Not because anyone stopped liking it, because someone told them it was low class. Number 24, fried cornmeal mush. You made it the night before. That was the secret. You cooked your cornmeal in salted water until it was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Then you poured it into a loaf pan and set it on the back porch to go cold and firm overnight. In the morning you sliced it, half an inch thick, like bread, and laid those slices in a skillet where bacon grease was already shimmering. 4 minutes aside. The outside went golden and slightly crisp. The inside stayed dense and warm, the color of sunlight through old glass. You ate it with molasses, sometimes with a little butter. Nothing else needed. In rural Appalachia and across the farming communities of Indiana and Illinois, in the late 1940s, a pound of cornmeal cost 5 cents. 1 pound fed a family of 4 for breakfast twice over. That is not poverty arithmetic, that is genius arithmetic. Today we call it polenta fries and charge $14 an order. Same corn, same technique. Different story they tell about who made it. Number 23, navy bean soup with ham hock. The ham hock went in first, cold water first thing in the morning. By the time it had simmered 2 hours, the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. Then the beans went in, dried navy beans soaked overnight, swollen and tender, along with half an onion, a bay leaf, black pepper, and nothing else that cost anything. The beans absorbed the smoke and the salt from the hock. The broth turned a color between cream and gold. In the Rust Belt factory towns of western Pennsylvania and the coal camps of eastern Kentucky in the 1940s and early 1950s, dried navy beans cost 8 cents a pound and a ham hock ran about 12 cents. The whole pot cost under 25 cents and fed a family of 6 for 2 days. 2 full days. A single serving of navy bean soup delivers 18 grams of protein, 16 grams of fiber, and significant amounts of iron, folate, and potassium. Nutritionists at land-grant universities documented this repeatedly throughout the 1940s. The grandmothers stirring those pots didn't need the documentation. They already knew. Number 22, salmon croquettes. 1 can. That was all it took. One 15-ounce can of pink salmon, bones and all, because the bones went soft in the canning process and dissolved into the patty and gave you calcium you didn't even know you were eating. You drained it, flaked it with a fork, mixed in a beaten egg, some crushed crackers, a little diced onion, salt and pepper, formed it into 6 oval patties, fried them in a cast iron skillet in about 2 tablespoons of oil until each side was deep brown and lightly crunchy. 6 patties, dinner for the family. 1 can of pink salmon in 1947 cost 19 cents at the A&P. In the mid-Atlantic states, in the working-class neighborhoods of Baltimore and Richmond and Charlotte, salmon croquettes appeared on the table at least once a week through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Today, restaurants put salmon cakes on the brunch menu for $22 a plate with a little caper aioli on the side. They act like they invented something. They didn't invent anything, they just forgot who showed them how. Number 21. Milk toast. This one is harder to explain to someone who has never had it. Not because it was complicated. It was the opposite of complicated. You buttered a piece of toast, laid it in a bowl, and poured warm milk over it, salted it lightly, sometimes a little sugar, sometimes nothing at all. You made it when someone was sick. You made it when a child couldn't sleep. You made it for yourself at midnight when the grief or the worry or the simple weight of the week had become too much to carry and you needed something that asked nothing of you. In New England and across the upper Midwest in the late 1940s, milk toast cost 2 cents to make. 2 cents. The whole bowl. It was the meal that said, I see you and I want to help in the plainest possible language food has ever spoken. It disappeared completely from American tables by the early 1960s, not because it stopped working, because the world got embarrassed by tenderness. Number 20, pinto beans and cornbread. This was not a side dish, let that be clear right now. In the Appalachian communities of Tennessee and Kentucky, in the sharecropper cabins of Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, in the small cinder block houses of working-class families who had come north to the cities but kept their grandmother's recipes, pinto beans and cornbread was the meal. The whole meal, the only meal some nights. Dried pinto beans at 7 cents a pound, cooked low and slow with a little salt pork or a ham bone, or sometimes nothing but an onion and black pepper, ladled into a bowl. A wedge of cornbread on the side, sometimes crumbled directly into the beans. Here is what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Pinto beans and corn, eaten together, form a complete protein. The amino acids in each grain complement the other's deficiencies precisely. These families weren't eating incomplete nutrition. They were running a biological system more sophisticated than anything a food scientist would publish for another 30. Number 19, scrapple everything the pig gave. That was the principle. After the hams and the chops and the roasts were cut, what remained went into a pot, the head meat, the organ scraps, the bits of snout and jowl, and it was simmered until the meat fell away from whatever held it together. Then it was strained and mixed with cornmeal and buckwheat flour and seasoned hard with sage and black pepper and thyme, and the whole thing was pressed into a loaf pan and left to set. In the morning you sliced it thick and fried it in a dry skillet until both sides formed a dark, crackling crust, while the interior stayed dense and almost custardy. Pennsylvania Dutch families in Lancaster County and the Delaware Valley had been making scrapple since the 1700s. By the late 1940s, it cost less than 10 cents a pound and fed a farm family through a full week of breakfasts. Today, you find artisanal scrapple at farmers markets in Philadelphia and Brooklyn, hand-labeled in craft paper for $12 a slab. The people selling it call it a heritage product. The grandmothers who made it called it Tuesday. Number 18, liver and onions. Nobody's favorite, everybody's dinner. Beef liver was 15 cents a pound in 1950 in the steel towns of Pittsburgh and Youngstown and Gary, Indiana, places where men came off 12-hour shifts with almost nothing left in their bodies. Liver and onions appeared on the table 2 or 3 times a week. Not because anyone loved it particularly, because the women who made it understood something that nutritional science would spend the next several decades trying to quantify. Beef liver contains more vitamin B12 per ounce than almost any other food on earth. It is dense with iron, with vitamin A, with folate and riboflavin, and copper. Physicians at Veterans Administration hospitals throughout the late 1940s actively prescribed liver consumption for returning soldiers presenting with anemia and fatigue after years of field rations. The prescription cost 15 cents a pound at the butcher. The onions went in first, low and slow, until they turned translucent and sweet. The liver went in last, barely 2 minutes aside, because overcooked liver is the reason people think they hate it. She was right about that, too. Everything she knew was right. Number 17. Vegetable beef soup from bones. The butcher knew you by name. That was the first thing. And when you asked for soup bones, he wrapped them in paper and sometimes didn't charge you at all, or charged you a nickel because bones were what was left after the real selling was done. You brought them home and put them in your largest pot with cold water and a splash of vinegar. The vinegar pulled the minerals out of the marrow, and you let them go all night on a low flame. In the morning, the kitchen smelled like something ancient and good. You strained the broth, pulled the soft marrow from the bones with a small spoon and stirred it back in, then added whatever vegetables the week had left behind. Carrots going slightly soft, half an onion, potatoes, canned tomatoes, dried barley if you had it. What people now pay $40 a bottle for in supplement form, collagen, glucosamine, bone-derived minerals, was simmering on the back of a post-war stove in 1948 for almost nothing. They knew things about slow-cooked bones that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 16, macaroni and tomatoes. Not spaghetti, not marinara, not anything with a name from a restaurant menu. Just macaroni, elbow macaroni, 10 cents a pound. Boiled soft and drained. And then a can of stewed tomatoes poured over it in the pot, a tablespoon of butter stirred through, salt, a little sugar to cut the acid if the tomatoes were sharp that week. Back on the heat for 5 minutes until everything melded together into something that tasted like it had been cooking all day, even though it hadn't. In the Italian immigrant neighborhoods of South Philadelphia and East Harlem and the working-class mill towns of New England, this dish needed no explanation and no occasion. It appeared on a Tuesday. It appeared on a Thursday. It appeared whenever there was almost nothing else, because almost nothing else was enough. Grandma just called it supper. It was always enough. Number 15, rice and milk, a pinch of sugar. That was the whole thing. You put last night's rice in a small saucepan, poured whole milk over it until it was just covered, set it on low heat and stirred it slowly until the milk had been absorbed and the rice had gone soft and slightly swollen, and the whole thing had taken on a consistency somewhere between pudding and porridge. In Louisiana and across the Deep South in the late 1940s, rice cost 8 cents a pound and whole milk was delivered to the door every other morning. This bowl appeared at breakfast. It appeared as a late-night comfort for children who couldn't sleep and adults who had too much to think about. Today it appears in small glass jars at specialty grocery stores labeled artisan rice pudding for $6 each. The recipe is identical. The shame is gone because now it has a price tag high enough to make it respectable. Number 14, fried potatoes and onions. The cast iron skillet never fully cooled in a working-class kitchen. There was always something in it or recently out of it, and whatever fat remained from the last meal stayed right there, because fat was flavor, and flavor was not something you threw away. Thick sliced potatoes. Half an onion cut into rough rings, into the hot skillet with a lid clamped on top for the first 10 minutes so the steam softened them through. Then the lid came off and the heat went up and you let the bottom sides go brown and crusted before you turned them. Salt. Black pepper, maybe a little paprika if the week had been good. In 1945, 10 pounds of potatoes cost 49 cents. This skillet fed 4 people for about 8 cents. It was not a side dish. On the nights when there was nothing else, when the paycheck had come up short or the week had run long, fried potatoes and onions was dinner. A complete dinner, and nobody at that table went to bed hungry. Number 13, Ham hocks and collard greens. You started the hocks in cold water before noon. Let them go 2 hours on their own, just bubbling, just releasing their smoke and salt into the water, until the broth had turned the color of weak tea and smelled like something that had been tended for generations. Then the collards went in. Big, dark, leathery leaves stripped from their center ribs and torn into pieces and pushed down into the pot, where they immediately began to shrink and darken and give up their bitterness into the broth. Another hour, maybe more, until the greens had gone completely tender and the hock meat was falling from the bone in soft, smoky ribbons. In the rural communities of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, in the late 1940s, a ham hock cost 13 cents, and the collards came from the garden. The pot liquor left in the bottom of the pot after everything was eaten, that dark, silky, mineral-rich broth, was poured over cornbread and eaten as a second meal. Not one. Number 12. Bread pudding. Monday's bread became Tuesday's dessert. That was the system. You saved the stale slices, the heels, the ends, the pieces that had gone too dry to eat comfortably, and by Tuesday you had enough. You tore them into rough chunks and packed them into a buttered baking dish. You beat 2 eggs with a cup of milk and a tablespoon of sugar and a splash of vanilla if you had it, and poured it over the bread and pressed everything down and let it soak for 20 minutes. Into the oven at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the top was dark gold and slightly puffed, and the inside had set into something that was not quite bread anymore, and not quite custard, but something better than either. The whole dish cost under 10 cents to make in 1947. Today, bread pudding with bourbon sauce is $14 at brunch restaurants in New Orleans and Nashville. The dish is identical. What changed was who they decided was allowed to claim credit for knowing how to make it. Number 11. Potato soup, 4 potatoes, 1 onion, a cup of milk, a tablespoon of butter, salt. That is the whole ingredient list. That is also, in the hands of the right woman, one of the finest things you can eat on a cold November evening. You diced the potatoes small, boiled them in just enough water to cover, then mashed some against the side of the pot with a fork so the broth thickened from the starch without adding anything extra. The onion went in raw at the beginning and softened into sweetness over 20 minutes. The milk and butter went in at the end so they didn't scorch. The result was something creamy without cream, thick without flour, warming in the specific way that only a bowl of hot potato soup in a cold kitchen can be warming. Irish immigrant grandmothers in Chicago and Cleveland had been making this from memory since before the century turned. Memory carried across an ocean from places where potato soup had meant the difference between eating and not eating. Number 10. American goulash. They called it goulash. They called it slumgullion. They called it American chop suey in New England and beefaroni in the Midwest. And in the end, none of the names mattered because everyone who grew up eating it knew exactly what it was without being told. 1 pound of ground beef, 35 cents in 1950, browned in the pot with a diced onion until the meat was no longer pink and the onion had gone soft and golden. A can of crushed tomatoes, a can of tomato sauce, a cup of water, salt, garlic powder, a bay leaf. Let it come to a simmer. Then a full box of elbow macaroni cooked right in the pot, absorbing the sauce as it softened. 1 pot, 1 hour, enough to feed 8 people. Today, Hamburger Helper sells you a box of powdered flavoring and pre-cooked noodles and charges you 3 times what that pot of real goulash cost, with half the food and none of the knowledge. Grandma just called it goulash. She made it from scratch. She fed everyone. She was right. Number 9. Mustard greens with salt pork. This is something that has to be said plainly, because the people who haven't eaten mustard greens properly cooked have only ever had them undercooked, and undercooked mustard greens are a punishment. Properly cooked, in a pot with salt pork at 8 cents a pound, simmered low for 90 minutes until every sharp edge of bitterness has been softened into something deep and complex and almost sweet at the finish. Mustard greens are one of the great vegetables of American cooking. In the Carolinas and Georgia and the hill counties of Tennessee, these were a cold weather staple of the late 1940s and 1950s. Vitamin K in concentrations that support bone density and cardiovascular function. Folate. Calcium, and here is the science that vindicates every woman who ever made this dish. The fat from the salt pork is not incidental. Number 8. Salt pork and milk gravy over biscuits. She was up at 5. The biscuits were in the oven by 5:15. They were made from flour and lard and buttermilk and a pinch of salt, nothing more. And they baked in a cast iron skillet in a hot oven for 12 minutes and came out tall and slightly golden and so tender that they split open at the lightest pressure. While they baked, the salt pork went into the skillet on the stovetop, thin sliced, fried until it crisped at the edges and released its fat into the pan. The pork came out, the flour went in, stirred fast into the drippings, then the milk, a slow pour, stirred constantly until the gravy came up thick and white and flecked with black pepper and the small dark bits of pork that stayed behind in the pan. Over the biscuits, everything together. In the rural communities of eastern Kentucky and western Tennessee in the late 1940s, this breakfast cost pennies and delivered the kind of warmth that carried a man through 12 hours of physical labor. This was not poor food. This was architecture. Number 7 bean and bacon sandwich. It was packed into a lunch pail before the sun came up. That is the first thing to understand about this sandwich. It was made in the dark by a woman who had already been awake for an hour, for a man who needed to eat his lunch at a workbench or on a factory floor or in the cab of a truck somewhere along a state highway. Pinto beans, cooked soft, mashed roughly with a fork, not smooth, not chunky, somewhere in between, seasoned with salt and a little of the cooking liquid to keep them spreadable. Spread thick on day-old white bread. A strip of bacon across the top. 2 slices pressed together in the steel mill towns of Gary, Indiana, and Youngstown, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the late 1940s. This sandwich cost under 10 cents and carried enough protein and complex carbohydrate to sustain 8 hours of heavy physical work. Number 6. Potato pancakes. 2 traditions, same dish, same skillet, in the Jewish immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side and Brownsville in Brooklyn. They were latkes, grated potato, grated onion, beaten egg, a little flour, salt, fried in schmaltz or oil until each side was deeply brown and lacy at the edges. In the German immigrant communities of Milwaukee and Cincinnati and the small Lutheran farming towns of Minnesota, they were Kartoffelpuffer. Same thing, different word, same skillet, same result. 3 potatoes, 1 egg, half an onion. The whole batch cost under 10 cents in 1948, served with sour cream if there was any, with applesauce, with nothing at all. Today they appear at upscale brunch spots with creme fraiche and smoked salmon, and a price tag of $16. And the restaurant acts as though it invented something elegant. It didn't invent anything. It just finally admitted that what the immigrant grandmothers knew was worth money. It just took 70 years and a markup of 1,500% to get there. Number 5. Hominy and fatback. The hominy came from a can, 7 cents, or from dried corn that had been soaked in an alkaline solution, a process called nixtamalization that the Aztecs developed thousands of years ago and that the mountain communities of Appalachia inherited through Cherokee foodways and adapted into their own tradition. The fatback went into the skillet first, rendered until the fat ran free and the pork bits went dark and crispy. The hominy went in next, into the hot fat, seared until the outside of each kernel took on a slight crust, while the inside stayed tender. Salt. Black pepper. That was it. In the hollows of eastern Kentucky and the ridge communities of West Virginia in the late 1940s, hominy and fatback was what appeared when the month had gone longer than the money. Here is the science. Nixtamalization increases the available niacin in corn by a factor of nearly 20. Raw corn contains niacin in a bound form the human body cannot absorb. Treated corn delivers it directly. These Appalachian women were doing nutritional chemistry on a wood stove with a lard can and a cast iron skillet. They knew things that the rest of the country is only beginning to understand. Number 4. Pea soup with ham. Sunday's ham went on the table. Monday, the bone went into a pot. In the Scandinavian and German immigrant communities of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, this was not a recipe. It was a reflex. The ham bone, whatever meat remained on it, cold water to cover, a pound of split peas that had soaked overnight, an onion cut in half and dropped in whole, a bay leaf, low heat. 3 hours, split peas cost 9 cents a pound in the early 1950s. The ham bone was free. It was what was left from Sunday's meal. By Monday noon, the soup was done, thick and green and smoky, the ham falling off the bone in soft shreds, the peas dissolved completely into the broth, so the whole thing had the consistency of something that had been tended and loved for a long time, which it had been. This was Monday in those kitchens. Every single Monday the bone became the meal that sustained the week. Nothing was ever, under any circumstances, wasted. Number 3. Fried salt mackerel. The night before was when you started it. You put the salt mackerel in a bowl of cold water and left it on the counter, or on the back porch in winter, to soak overnight, drawing the brine out of the flesh slowly, so that by morning what you had was fish that was seasoned but no longer preserved, tender but still firm, ready to cook. The whole house smelled like the Atlantic. You drained it, patted it dry, laid it in a cast-iron skillet with a little lard already shimmering, skin side down first, and you did not move it for 4 minutes. Then you turned it once. 4 minutes on the other side. The skin went almost black and crackled at the touch. The flesh inside was white and flaky and tasted like the ocean and something smoky and something very old. In the fishing communities of coastal Maine and the working-class neighborhoods of New Bedford and Gloucester in the late 1940s, salt mackerel cost 12 cents a pound. Today, pan-seared mackerel with herb butter and charred lemon is $28 at every seafood bistro that opened in the last 15 years. Same fish, same method, different story they tell about where the knowledge came from. Number 2, oxtail stew. The butcher put oxtails in the case because no one else wanted them. In 1950, oxtail ran about 10 cents a pound. The joints, the knuckles, the thick tapered sections of tail, cuts that required time and patience but gave back something that quick cuts never could. In the black communities of Birmingham and Atlanta and the back streets of New Orleans, and in the Puerto Rican and Caribbean neighborhoods taking root in East Harlem and the South Bronx in the late 1940s, oxtail stew was not a consolation meal. It was a deliberate one. You seasoned the pieces overnight. You browned them hard in a Dutch oven, in batches, until each surface was deeply caramelized. Then the onions, the garlic, the tomatoes, the allspice, the thyme, everything went in, and then enough water or broth to come halfway up the meat, and the lid went on, and the heat went low, and 4 hours later you had a stew so rich and dark and deeply flavored that the broth alone could have been its own course. The collagen in those joints, the connective tissue that 4 hours of low heat had completely dissolved into the broth, is what gives the stew its body, its silkiness, its almost lip-coating richness. Today, oxtail is $8 a pound at specialty butchers and $12 a pound at restaurants that list it as a heritage cut and nose-to-tail cooking. The families in East Harlem who ate this every Sunday in 1951 never needed anyone to tell them it was sophisticated. They already knew. In 1945, the men came home with duffel bags and tired eyes and not much else. They came back from the Pacific, from Europe, from mess halls in the Philippines and foxholes in France, where they had eaten whatever the army put in front of them and been grateful for it. And when they walked through the front door, something was already on the stove. It was always already on the stove. Because the women hadn't stopped cooking during the war, they had cooked through rationing, through meat shortages, through butter stamps and sugar books, and weeks when the grocery store shelves looked half empty. They had learned things in those years. Real things, the kind you learn when you have no margin for error and a family standing at the table waiting. They knew how to make something from almost nothing. They knew how to feed 5 people on what a restaurant today would throw in the trash. For about 10 years after the war ended, those kitchens kept running. The meals kept coming. And then, very deliberately, someone decided that was embarrassing. Someone decided these women needed to be modern. They needed convenience. They needed to stop doing what they were doing. These are the meals that got erased. 25 of them, and not one of them deserved to disappear.